When Europeans first ventured into central Massachusetts, the territory was populated by small clans belonging to the Nipmuc tribe. The land that later became Grafton was inhabited by the Hassanamesit clan. In the spring and summer, the native women would grow vegetables and fruits, while the men would fish and hunt. In the fall, the women would harvest crops, while the men made war and peace with neighboring tribes. The clan would move to the valleys in the winter, but would return to the fields in the spring in time for the women to do the planting. We know that they ate wild game, wild grains, seeds, nuts, and roots, and supplemented those by growing maize, beans, and squash. Although the territory was thickly wooded, the natives created a frontier pathway through the area. The earliest contact between the natives of this area and the English settlers occurred in 1636, when this frontier path was used by Thomas Hooker on his journey to Connecticut. Hooker was a preacher who disagreed with the Puritan leaders and led a group of 100 into the frontier wilderness to establish the city of Hartford. During this journey, his wife was an invalid and had to be carried. By the 1640s, the Reverend John Eliot, a missionary from the Boston area, was actively preaching Christianity to the native populations in central Massachusetts. He established a series of villages of Christianized natives, which he called praying Indian towns. Natick was the first of these villages and has kept its native name. Punkapoag of present-day Canton was the second. Grafton was the third village and was named Hassanamesit, meaning place of small stones. Other nearby praying Indian towns were located in the communities now known as Ashland, Auburn, Webster, and Littleton. The natives of Hassanamesit were devout Christians and were very effective in helping the Reverend Eliot convert other native clans in the surrounding area. One member of their group, Wawos, known to the English as James the Printer, became a talented interpreter for the Reverend Eliot and helped him translate the Bible into the Algonquin language.
You might wonder how James the Printer had become educated during these early years of the New England settlement when it was just a frontier. But the ability to read the Bible was central to the Puritan religion, and for that reason they set up schools very soon after arriving. Only 6 years after coming to Boston in 1630, they established Harvard College in Cambridge. It was founded to educate the sons of the early settlers. But less known is the fact that they also established an Indian college at Harvard to educate natives. James the Printer attended the Indian College in 1659, and he later worked as a printer in Cambridge. To the English Puritans of the 1600s, being a Christian required a specific lifestyle. They believed that walking in the way of the Lord meant living like Englishmen, with order, predictability, and discipline. And they saw the natives as living a wild and unruly life. So they tried to convince the natives to live in English-style buildings on discreet homesteads and to maintain English work habits. The Nipmuc men were forbidden to wear their hair long, to grease their bodies, to engage in premarital sex, or to crack lice between their teeth, and other native habits. Flogging was the penalty for breaking these rules. Although the natives gave lip service to these principles, they maintained their own tribal customs.
The natives and the settlers enjoyed good relations during the early years, in spite of English insensitivity to native beliefs and tribal customs. But by the 1670s, racial and cultural tensions had increased, and the number of Europeans moving into the coastal areas had reduced the territory of the natives. A number of incidents between English authorities and the natives escalated into violence in 1675, when 3 natives were accused of a crime and were hung by the English. The resulting conflict became known as King Philip's War. Metacomet, a Wampanoag chief, known by the English as King Philip, was a son of Massasoit, the native who helped the Mayflower Pilgrims survive their first New England winters. In 1675, Metacomet led a group of natives in guerrilla attacks on the English settlers. 55 towns were attacked, nearly half of all the communities in the region. Most communities had only a stockade and a small local militia for defense. Those towns without such defenses were simply abandoned. The settlements at Providence and Springfield were burned to the ground. Great atrocities were committed on both sides. Although the praying Indians declared themselves to be neutral, some were kidnapped by King Philip's followers and forced to fight.
The town of Hassanamesit was attacked by Philip's men, who gave the male inhabitants the choice of either joining them or having the village's entire winter food supply burned. Most of them chose to join Philip. One of these was James the Printer, who had returned to the village by this time. Printer is thought to be the author of 2 letters sent from Philip to the colonists. The first letter was found tacked to a bridge post outside of the town of Medfield in 1675. The letter gave a rationale for the insurrection, explaining that the English had provoked the Native Americans to war and that the natives felt they had nothing to lose in the fight except their lives. Many of the praying Indians were loyal to the English and served as guides in the war, but the English distrusted them. The natives who remained at Hassanamesit were forced to move to Natick, and later all of the praying Indians were imprisoned on Deer Island in Boston Harbor. The island is rocky and has very little wildlife or shelter, and as a result, most died of exposure or starvation.
The uprising was defeated in 14 months, and Philip was killed. His remaining forces were either killed or sold into slavery along with their families. The end result of King Philip's War was the destruction of the friendly relationship between the English settlers and the natives. The war was so terrifying to the Europeans that the culture was left with a view of the Native Americans as ignorant savages, an attitude that lasted for centuries. The major effect of this war on Grafton was that it brought an end to the praying Indian town. Although the Hassanamesit clan retained legal claim of the Hassanamesit land, it took 25 years for the surviving tribal members to return to this area. In 1674, there had been 12 families with 60 members living here. By 1700, only 7 adult members of 4 of these families remained on this land. By the early 1700s, the colony of Massachusetts had experienced a great influx of new settlers, mostly farmers. The coastal areas became increasingly crowded, and coastal farms got smaller and smaller as farmers divided their farmland to provide for sons and grandsons. The fertile farmland in central Massachusetts became very attractive. The first Englishman to settle on the Hassanamesit land is believed to have been Elisha Johnson. He was permitted to purchase a tract of land on condition that he build and maintain bridges over the Blackstone River for the natives. By 1718, the Willard family, whose grandsons became famous clockmakers, had bought land and built a home here. A few other settlers were permitted to purchase land so that by 1728, 9 English families had established homes here. A member of the Hassanamesit clan named Nettus owned a portion of the land at Hassanamesit. Nettus set his son to be educated in Cambridge by a tutor named Elijah Corlett, and incurred a debt for school expenses. Corlett took him to court to settle the debt and was awarded 320 acres of land owned by Nettus. This tract of land changed hands several times before it was finally purchased by Joseph Willard in 1717.
Joseph Willard kept a herd of cattle there and used the land to grow hay. The next year he built a small house and brought his wife Martha to live on the property. Their first child, Sarah, born in 1718, was the first white child to be born in what is now Grafton. Joseph and Martha were grandparents to 4 famous clockmakers: Benjamin, Simon, Ephraim, and Aaron Willard. The eldest, Benjamin, moved to Hartford to work, where he learned clockmaking. He later returned to Grafton. Simon apprenticed to a clockmaker named Morris and later joined his brother. The Willard brothers made their first clocks in their small Grafton workshop around 1766. They moved their business to Roxbury, where they became renowned clockmakers. In 1802, Simon Willard obtained a patent for his banjo clock, which is considered to be one of the most significant styles of early 19th century American timepieces. The family farm in North Grafton is now the Willard House and Clock Museum.
In 1728, a group of 40 investors, mostly farmers from eastern Massachusetts, purchased 7,500 acres of land from the Nipmucs for £2,500 sterling. The Massachusetts court had the land assessed and approved the transaction. The governor named the new town Grafton, after the Duke of Grafton, a relative of the English king. This sale of land to English investors left the Nipmucs only 1,200 acres. The money from the purchase was held in escrow for the natives and was eventually embezzled. Other corrupt practices and financial misfortunes resulted in the loss of most of the remaining land, so that by 1861 the Nipmucs owned only a small 4-acre reservation tract. At present, Grafton is home to the Hassanamesit Reservation, an historic site with approximately 4 acres of land that has never been owned or lived on by non-native people. The reservation is part of the original 8,700-acre Hassanamesit plantation established by Reverend Eliot. This reservation on the eastern slope of Brigham Hill is the location of an 1801 building known as the Homestead. During the early 20th century, the Cisco family resided there and became tribal leaders and stewards of the reservation.
James L. Cisco became chief of the Nipmucs in the 1920s. He was succeeded by his son Samuel and later by his daughter, Sarah Cisco Sullivan, also known as Princess Sweetflower. Sarah lived on the Grafton Reservation all her life. She served as hostess of the Indian fairs and educated local young people about Nipmuc culture. Her daughter Zara Cisco Bro, known as Princess Whiteflower, also held the title of chief of the Nipmuc tribe. Zara was a very talented woman. She was president of a consulting company, a technical writer, and a fashion designer. The Cisco family is descended from James the Printer.
Annual tribal gatherings at the reservation began in the 1920s and have continued to this day. The Hassanamesit Indian Fair continues to engage the public in tribal ceremonies each summer. The homestead is no longer used as a residence, but continues to be the focus of Nipmuc cultural activities. The reservation today is maintained by the Nipmuc Nation Tribal Council. Over the years, there has been much interest in locating the site of the original praying Indian village, where historic records report that a church was built in 1671. The center of that early Hassanamesit settlement is thought to be located on Keith Hill. Between 2003 and 2014, the Fisk Center for Archaeological Research excavated a site hoping to identify the early village location. Their work uncovered the 1800 home of Sarah Boston, a descendant of the original praying Indians, and is the likely site of that early village.